folks, the #1 David Lynch fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Chrystabell and David Lynch record, Cellophane Memories. Chrystabell is probably only a name particularly familiarized within the realm of ambient pop, alternative ambient pop fandom, primarily due to the 2011 album This Train from Chrystabell, a somewhat cult classic within that particular realm of alternative/underground music, but obviously the much bigger name on this record is David Lynch, who, if you don't know who David Lynch is at this point in pop culture history, I do not know what to tell you. Legendary director behind such classics as Eraserhead and Mulholland Drive and Blue Velvet, among many, many others, one of the most influential and culturally prominent and massive directors of all time, and also he does music sometimes, and that's an example of him doing music here on this record, and I mean, he's definitely more acclimated to film than music, I'll say that, but that's besides the point. As much as I do like to joke around about how I think David Lynch should stick to cinema for the most part, I actually do think he's put out some good music in the past. At the very least, when I don't love his stuff, I at least find it very intriguing, and some of the solo music that he's put out in the past handful of years has been pretty interesting and very uniquely his, feeling like a fairly accurate musical representation of his very surreal and disorienting film style. And now here we are with this collaborative album with Chrystabell going in a very semi-noir, dark, ambient direction with some pop influences in a way that I feel should be much more interesting and much more gripping than it actually ends up being. Now, while David Lynch may obviously be the most famous name attached to this project, Chrystabell is really the vocal representative of the album at large, providing the vocals for the record, and ultimately, while I do feel that she does provide some interesting vocal performances, they don't feel particularly spectacular in one way or another. I'm not trying to say that she is an incompetent vocalist or anything like that. She suits the ambient-based material perfectly fine for what is being presented here. Yet, at the same time, I can't help but feel that she really does, in terms of personality, hugely blend in with a plethora of other more drone-based experimental pop albums that have come out in the last 20, 30 years. I mean, there's just nothing particularly impressive being done by her here, which is a shame because she really is a competent vocalist. It's just that she never takes her own vocal work in any direction that feels particularly uniquely hers in any specific way, which is a shame because it causes the album at large to feel significantly more bland in turn. I mean, some of the all-time great ambient forward pop albums put out by bands and artists like Broadcast, Arthur Russell, Low, and I feel obligated to mention her because of the David Lynch connection, Julie Cruz, are ultimately great because they are their own unique takes on what constitutes ambient pop music. They are completely distinguishable from one another and only really have base roots in the general concept of, for the most part at least, semi-minimalistic production and style of aesthetic. And here, it's just the absolute base ideas of ambient pop. There is minimalistic performance here in terms of composition. There is very straightforward and at times misty vocal performances, but none of it really goes anywhere in a particular direction that makes it feel like anything beyond, again, the most basic form of ambient pop that there ever could be, and that's something that severely damages the quality of an album like this in my eyes when it's a record that's very obviously trying to put forward a certain aesthetic and a certain atmosphere, a very dark vibe that I personally just can't really connect with when I feel like this record isn't doing anything interesting with the sounds that it's working with, which is a real shame considering there are two talented people involved here. And from that same perspective, I do think it could be said that, again, Chrystabell's vocal performances here, while fine for what they are, don't really manage to achieve anything that allows this album to feel of note in that regard. I mean, there are plenty of records with vocal performances similar to hers, that sound like hers, and there are plenty of records that are more unique in terms of a vocalist delivering a performance that manages to match the overall tone of the record while nonetheless carving out a unique space within the realm of ambient pop vocal performances historically. That's just something I feel this record does not manage to achieve, and specifically something that she doesn't manage to achieve on this record. And that really isn't to say that Lynch's contributions to the record are that much better, because if I'm being completely honest, I don't really think they are, and I would even argue that his contributions to Cellophane Memories are even more of a disappointment than Chrystabell's, considering he pretty objectively has the longer sheet of excellent projects that he's been involved with, both in terms of music and the arts in general. But it just feels like his work behind this record, it doesn't manage to achieve much at all. Obviously, I'm not expecting everything that David Lynch is involved with to be the most groundbreaking piece of media ever made or anything like that, but at the same time, I do really wish that there was something more coming from him here other than what feels like him attempting to recreate the soundtracks of some of his most beloved works, like Mulholland Drive and the Twin Peaks series especially, being very prominent influences here. On one hand, I actually kind of appreciate that quality about this record and want to say I enjoy it, but there's another part of me that recognizes that's mainly due to the unfortunate passing of legendary Lynch collaborator and composer Angelo Badalamenti, and in that sense, I enjoy this record because it feels almost like a tribute to him, even if it's not intended to be such a record, because it does reflect a lot of the ideas that he proposed in the soundtracks of the Lynch media that he composed for, among various other works that he put forth in his lifetime. And again, in that sense, I think it's interesting to see someone who's not Badalamenti making a record that sounds like Badalamenti, but in that same regard, I can't help but feel like this just feels like a cheaper and less engaging version of the soundtracks to some of Lynch's past works that have ultimately made some of his films the extremely mysterious and engrossing works that they are. It just feels like a budget version of something that was once great, now that the original composer has unfortunately passed on. It just feels like Cellophane Memories was a very promising collaboration between two individuals that could have brought their own unique styles together to make something equally unique. Lynch bringing a lot of his more surrealist tendencies, Chrystabell bringing a lot of her more heartfelt yet haunting tendencies vocally, together into a project that could have been a deeply interesting listen that you couldn't really get from either of their solo careers or from any other artist out there right now. But instead, the final form of Cellophane Memories as a record feels more like an album that's doing its best to recreate some of the more beloved works throughout the discographies of both and the filmography of Lynch in terms of soundtrack work, and not really managing to recapture the magic for any of that, really. I mean, that's not to say that this album is bad. It's perfectly fine. It just feels bare bones in the wrong way. Rather than feeling like this mystical, minimalistic, emotional journey through a very nighttime kind of setting and aesthetic, it feels more just like ambient pop taken to its most basic and really uninteresting form. And I don't think that's the worst thing in the world, but I do think it's a major disappointment when you consider who is involved here. And hey, as a big David Lynch fan, as a big fan of generally atmospheric music, as a big fan of music that tries to be very sort of dark and brooding, but in a subtle way, like a lot of ambient pop does, I just can't click with this in any way. I respect it. I think it's an interesting concept on paper, and I am very okay with the idea of David Lynch continuing to work in the ambient pop realm in the future, in particular, Chrystabell having been doing so for many years at this point, of course. And as a whole, I think that this album could potentially be an interesting stepping stone for both of them into new eras of their career, potentially using this record as a means to kick off into some new work, as both are kind of being highlighted by each other's respective fan bases, fandoms, and the kind of crowds attracted to Chrystabell's music and Lynch's overall body of work, respectively. But in terms of this being a record alone, isolated, just by Chrystabell, David Lynch, as an ambient pop record with nocturnal vibes to it, it doesn't feel like anything special, and it truly is a shame because the people behind it are. So yeah, I don't hate it, and I respect the ethereal quality of it and all that, but by and large, there's just nothing to really latch onto here or to point out as something especially notable. Songs just kind of bleed together into nothingness, and it's a major disappointment, again, coming from two talented individuals and artists. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I will see you in the next one.